The lumber sitting in your local Home Depot right now costs more than it did 3 months ago. The 2x4s stacked in warehouses across the Pacific Northwest are being repriced as you watch this. And the home you were planning to build, renovate, or purchase in 2026 just became significantly more expensive. Not because of inflation, not because of labor shortages, but because of a policy decision made in Washington that most Americans never saw coming. On February 4, 2025, President Donald Trump signed an executive order imposing a 25% tariff on all goods imported from Canada. That rate has since escalated. The effective tariff on Canadian softwood lumber now sits at 45% when combined with existing countervailing and anti-dumping duties that were already in place. This is not a negotiating tactic. This is not a temporary measure designed to extract concessions. This is the new baseline for cross-border trade between the two largest trading partners on Earth. The consequences are not abstract. They are measurable. They are immediate. And they are being passed directly to American consumers in ways that will reshape the housing market for years to come. To understand why a tariff on Canadian wood adds $10,000 to the cost of an American home, you need to understand how deeply integrated the North American construction supply chain actually is. The relationship between Canadian forests and American homes is not incidental. It is structural. It was built over decades of trade agreements, infrastructure investment, and market logic that made geographic neighbors into economic partners. Canada supplies approximately 30% of all softwood lumber consumed in the United States. In some regions, particularly the Pacific Northwest and the Northern Midwest, that figure climbs above 50%. The wood comes primarily from British Columbia, Quebec, and Ontario, harvested from managed forests that span millions of acres and processed through mills that employ tens of thousands of Canadian workers. This lumber crosses the border through established corridors. Rail lines connect Canadian mills directly to American distribution centers. Trucking routes have operated continuously for generations. The logistics infrastructure exists specifically because the trade relationship was assumed to be permanent. American homebuilders did not choose Canadian lumber because of some ideological preference. They chose it because it was available, affordable, and high quality. The economics were straightforward. Canadian provincial governments own vast tracts of timberland and charge stumpage fees that allow mills to operate profitably while keeping prices competitive. American builders could purchase framing lumber, plywood, and oriented strand board at prices that made single-family home construction financially viable for middle-class buyers. That equation has now been fundamentally altered. The National Association of Home Builders released its analysis within weeks of the tariff implementation. Their economists calculated that a 45% effective duty on Canadian softwood lumber adds approximately $10,200 to the average cost of a new single-family home. For multifamily construction, the figure is approximately $4,000 per unit. These are not projections based on theoretical models. These are calculations derived from actual material costs, current lumber prices, and the standard quantity of wood required to frame a typical American residence. The math is not complicated. A typical single-family home requires roughly 16,000 board feet of lumber. At pre-tariff prices, that lumber cost approximately $35,000. With a 45% tariff applied to Canadian imports, and with Canadian lumber representing a significant portion of supply, the average price per 1,000 board feet has increased by more than $60. Multiply that across the full material requirement of a home, and you arrive at the $10,000 figure that builders are now absorbing or passing through to buyers. Some will absorb a portion of the increase to remain competitive. Many cannot afford to. Margins in residential construction are already thin. The average profit margin for a home builder ranges between 5 and 10%, depending on the market. A $10,000 increase in material costs on a $400,000 home represents a 2.5% hit to the final price. If the builder absorbs that entirely, their margin evaporates. If they pass it through, the buyer pays. The buyers who can least afford this increase are precisely the buyers the housing market is already failing. First-time homebuyers, young families stretching to qualify for mortgages, middle-income households in regions where housing costs have already outpaced wage growth. These are the Americans who were already priced out of homeownership in many markets. The tariff pushes the threshold higher. The administration's stated rationale for the Canada tariffs centers on trade balance concerns and national security considerations. The argument, as articulated by Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and Trade Representative Jameson Greer, frames Canadian imports as a threat to American industry and American workers. The tariffs, according to this logic, will incentivize domestic production, bring manufacturing jobs back to American soil, and reduce dependence on foreign supply chains. This argument contains elements of truth wrapped in layers of oversimplification. American lumber production has declined over the past 2 decades. Mills have closed. Jobs have been lost. Communities that once depended on timber harvesting have seen their economic foundations erode. These are real harms experienced by real Americans, and they deserve serious policy attention. But the tariff solution assumes a production capacity that does not currently exist. American mills cannot simply scale up to replace 30% of national lumber supply. The infrastructure is not there. The workforce is not there. The timber reserves, while substantial, are governed by environmental regulations, property rights, and harvest limits that prevent rapid expansion. The United States Forest Service manages approximately 193 million acres of national forest land. Much of this land is subject to restrictions that limit commercial logging. Environmental reviews required under the National Environmental Policy Act can delay timber sales for years. Litigation from conservation groups frequently blocks harvests that have already been approved. The regulatory framework governing American timber is fundamentally different from the Canadian system, and those differences cannot be erased by tariff policy. Private timberland in the United States is concentrated among a relatively small number of institutional owners. Real estate investment trusts, pension funds, and timber investment management organizations control millions of acres. These entities manage their holdings for long-term return, which means they harvest according to sustainable yield calculations rather than short-term demand signals. A spike in lumber prices does not automatically translate to increased harvests. It takes years to grow merchantable timber. It takes months to permit and construct new mill capacity. It takes time to train workers in specialized forestry and manufacturing roles. The tariff creates an immediate price increase that will be felt by consumers within months. The domestic production response, if it materializes at all, will unfold over years. In the interim, American homebuyers subsidize a policy experiment with uncertain outcomes. The housing market was already under severe strain before the tariffs took effect. The National Association of Realtors reported that existing home sales in 2024 fell to their lowest level in nearly 30 years. Mortgage rates, while down from their 2023 peaks, remain elevated by historical standards. Inventory remains constrained in most metropolitan markets. The median existing home price has continued to climb even as transaction volumes decline. New home construction was supposed to be the release valve. With existing inventory tight, builders were positioned to fill the gap. Housing starts had shown modest recovery through late 2024 and early 2025. Permits were being pulled. Projects were breaking ground. The industry was cautiously optimistic that production could begin to address the chronic undersupply that has characterized American housing for more than a decade. The tariff disrupts that calculus. Builders operate on fixed budgets derived from project financing secured months in advance. When material costs spike unexpectedly, projects that were financially viable become marginal or unprofitable. Some builders will proceed and absorb losses. Others will delay starts, waiting for clarity on whether tariff levels will hold or be adjusted. Still others will cancel projects entirely, determining that the risk profile no longer justifies the investment. The delay effect compounds over time. A project delayed by 6 months means homes that would have entered the market in late 2026 now arrive in 2027 or later. Multiply this across thousands of developments nationwide, and the aggregate impact on housing supply becomes substantial. The tariff does not just raise prices on homes being built today. It reduces the number of homes that will be built tomorrow. The geographic distribution of impact is not uniform. Regions most dependent on Canadian lumber face the sharpest cost increases. The Pacific Northwest, where proximity to British Columbia has made Canadian imports the default supply source, will see the most dramatic shifts. Builders in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana have limited alternatives. Domestic mills in these regions cannot meet local demand. Shipping lumber from the American Southeast adds transportation costs that offset some of the tariff penalty, but create new logistical challenges. The Southeast itself presents a different picture. The region is home to the majority of American softwood production. Mills in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and the Carolinas process timber from extensive pine plantations that were established decades ago. These operations are positioned to capture some of the demand displaced from Canadian suppliers. Prices in the region will rise, benefiting domestic producers. But the capacity constraints remain real. Southern mills were already operating at high utilization rates. The surge in demand triggered by tariff-driven import substitution creates bottlenecks that push prices higher across the board. The inflationary impulse does not stop at lumber. Construction materials exist within an ecosystem of complementary goods. Plywood and oriented strand board, both subject to the same tariffs on Canadian imports, are used for sheathing, subfloors, and roof decking. Prices on these products have already increased in parallel with dimensional lumber. Concrete, steel, and other materials face their own supply constraints, and overall construction cost indices have trended upward since the tariff announcement. Labor markets in construction add another layer of complexity. The industry faces a chronic skilled worker shortage that predates the current administration. The average age of construction workers continues to rise. Apprenticeship programs have not kept pace with retirement rates. Immigration policy has tightened pathways for workers who might otherwise fill gaps in the construction workforce. The combination of higher material costs and constrained labor supply creates conditions that favor larger, well-capitalized builders over smaller operators. National home builders with balance sheets that can absorb temporary margin compression will outcompete regional and local builders who lack that cushion. Market consolidation accelerates, competition decreases. The long-term effect is an industry structure that prioritizes scale over responsiveness to local market conditions. The political dimensions of this policy choice are significant and underappreciated. Housing affordability has emerged as a top-tier concern for voters across the political spectrum. Surveys consistently show that Americans rank housing costs among their most pressing economic anxieties. Young voters, in particular, express frustration at being locked out of home ownership that previous generations took for granted. The tariff policy runs directly counter to these concerns. It raises costs. It constrains supply. It makes the problem worse rather than better. The administration has not articulated how its trade policy aligns with its stated goal of improving affordability for American families. The contradiction sits in plain view, unaddressed and unresolved. The Canadian response has followed predictable patterns. Prime Minister Mark Carney, who assumed office in March 2025 following Justin Trudeau's resignation, has framed the tariffs as an unjustified attack on a trusted ally. Retaliatory measures have been implemented, targeting American agricultural exports, bourbon, and manufactured goods. The escalation cycle that trade economists warned about is now underway. Canada is not without leverage. American exports to Canada totaled approximately $350 billion in 2024. Canadian consumers purchase American automobiles, machinery, agricultural products, and a vast array of manufactured goods. Retaliatory tariffs on these products harm American workers and American companies, just as Canadian tariffs harm Canadian interests. The aluminum and dairy sectors have become particular flashpoints. American aluminum producers initially welcomed tariffs that they believed would advantage domestic production. But aluminum inputs are used throughout American manufacturing, from automotive to aerospace to beverage packaging. Higher aluminum costs flow through to finished goods prices, creating inflationary pressure that partially offsets any benefit to primary producers. The integrated nature of North American manufacturing means that components cross the border multiple times during production. An automobile assembled in Michigan may contain parts manufactured in Ontario that incorporate raw materials processed in Texas. Tariffs applied at each crossing accumulate, raising final product costs in ways that are difficult to trace but impossible to avoid. The dairy dispute involves supply management, a Canadian system that controls production and maintains stable prices for Canadian farmers. American dairy producers have long sought greater access to the Canadian market. The tariff regime has intensified this conflict without resolving the underlying structural differences between the two systems. None of these disputes existed in isolation before the tariff escalation. They were managed through diplomatic channels, trade representative negotiations, and the dispute resolution mechanisms established under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. That agreement, negotiated during Trump's first term, was supposed to provide a framework for addressing trade frictions without resorting to unilateral action. The current tariff policy effectively abandons that framework, substituting executive action for institutional process. The uncertainty this creates extends beyond lumber and housing. Business investment decisions across sectors depend on expectations about future policy. Companies evaluating whether to build new facilities, expand operations, or enter new markets must factor tariff risk into their calculations. The volatility itself becomes a drag on economic activity, independent of the specific tariff rates in effect at any given moment. Financial markets have registered the impact. Home builder stocks declined sharply following the tariff announcement. The SPDR S&P Homebuilders ETF fell more than 12% in the weeks following implementation. Investors repriced expectations for earnings growth, reflecting the margin compression that builders will face as material costs rise faster than home prices can be increased. The Federal Reserve faces a complicated landscape. Tariff-driven price increases create inflationary pressure that might ordinarily warrant tighter monetary policy. But the simultaneous drag on economic activity from reduced construction and business investment argues for accommodation. The central bank cannot easily address a problem that originates in trade policy rather than monetary conditions. Consumer sentiment surveys show rising concern about economic direction. The University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index has declined in consecutive months, with respondents citing tariff policy as a source of anxiety about future prices and economic stability. This sentiment effect can become self-reinforcing. Consumers who expect prices to rise may pull back spending. Businesses that observe weakening demand may delay investment. The expectation of economic difficulty can contribute to actual economic difficulty. The housing market sits at the center of these dynamics. Residential real estate is the largest asset class for most American households. Home equity represents the primary source of wealth accumulation for middle-class families. When housing becomes less affordable, when prices rise faster than incomes, when the path to ownership becomes more difficult, the consequences extend far beyond the construction industry. They reshape family formation decisions. They influence geographic mobility. They affect retirement security for generations. The $10,000 figure captures immediate material cost impact. It does not capture the full scope of what this policy choice means. It does not account for the projects that will not be built, the buyers who will be priced out, the communities that will see housing development slow or stop, the ripple effects through local economies that depend on construction activity. The administration maintains that tariffs will ultimately benefit American workers by reshoring production and reducing trade deficits. This argument requires believing that domestic capacity will expand rapidly enough to replace imports, that price increases will be temporary rather than persistent, and that retaliatory measures by trading partners will not offset whatever gains accrue to protected industries. The historical evidence for these beliefs is not encouraging. Tariffs imposed during Trump's first term on steel, aluminum, and Chinese goods produced mixed results at best. Some domestic producers benefited, but downstream industries that use these materials as inputs faced higher costs. Manufacturing employment, which was supposed to surge, showed modest gains that predated the tariffs and did not accelerate afterward. The trade deficit with China narrowed temporarily before widening again as supply chains adjusted. The lumber tariff follows this pattern. It will raise prices. It will benefit some domestic producers in some regions. It will impose costs on a far larger population of American consumers. And it will not, in any realistic time frame, create the domestic production capacity needed to replace Canadian imports without sustained price increases. The question now is whether political accountability follows economic consequence. Voters who supported the administration, expecting policies that would lower costs and improve their economic circumstances, will instead experience higher housing costs attributable directly to policy choices made in Washington. Whether they connect those costs to those choices depends on how the story is told and who tells it. The home you wanted to build just got more expensive. The renovation you were planning now costs more than you budgeted. The house you hoped to buy has moved further out of reach. These are not abstract policy outcomes. They are personal financial realities that millions of American families will experience in the months and years ahead. The tariff was a choice. It was not inevitable. It was not required by economic necessity or national security imperative. It was a decision made by people in positions of power who determined that the benefits, as they calculated them, outweighed the costs as they would be borne by others. The calculation may prove correct. Domestic lumber production may expand. Prices may stabilize at new equilibria that American consumers eventually accept. The housing market may adjust in ways that partially mitigate the affordability impact. Or the calculation may prove catastrophically wrong. Housing supply may contract. Prices may continue climbing. The affordability crisis may deepen into a structural barrier that locks an entire generation out of homeownership. The economic and social consequences of that failure would extend far beyond lumber prices and tariff policy. The outcome remains uncertain. What is certain is that the policy has been implemented, the prices have begun to rise, and American families will pay the cost. The question is no longer whether the tariff will have an impact. The question is how large that impact will be, how long it will persist, and whether the political system will respond before the damage becomes irreversible. The lumber is already priced. The contracts are being written. The homes that will cost $10,000 more are being designed and permitted right now. This is not a future problem. It is a present reality unfolding in real time across every housing market in America.